Today I'm talking about chapters 10 and 11 of No Man Knows My History. Alright, so today I'm starting with chapter 10, The Army of the Lord. We finished up last week talking about the tumultuous time that is happening in Missouri, and the temples are being built, Joseph's United Orders have collapsed, and he is having a lot of problems with the Missouri group. At this point is when the affidavits against Joseph's character that I read very early on in this series, this is when they were printed in the book. And so Joseph is having to deal with a lot of negativity toward himself. And so it's kind of funny, but she talks about how people closest to him are trying to counteract that by, making sure that they're getting the stories out there, the positive stories. But Martin Harris, goes a little too far sometimes. And she does bring up that he was indiscreet enough to tell a friend confidentially that the prophet had drunk too much liquor while translating the Book of Mormon. Brought to the trial by the High Council for this heresy, he amended the statement to say that the drunkenness had occurred previous to the translation. I just thought that was kind of a funny addition, just because when we talk about Joseph Smith in the church, we do talk about him in a way that sounds like he didn't drink alcohol, and we know that he did even after the word of wisdom. And so there's a lot of talk about Joseph going on. And at this time, Brigham Young said, if he acts like a devil, he has brought forth a doctrine that will save us if we abide by it. He may get drunk every day of his life, sleep with his neighbor's wife every night, run horses and gamble, but the doctrine he has produced will save you and me and the whole world. And I think a lot of people still hold that viewpoint of Joseph Smith. It doesn't matter what he did, because they still believe that he brought forth this gospel that is more important than anything that he did, anything church leaders now do, and you're given a pass because they believe this. That's why I think it's so important not just to focus only on Joseph Smith, but also on the doctrine itself, which I will eventually do. But there was one thing that his followers at this time could not forgive or overlook, and that was his seeming lethargy about the fate of Zion. His people were expecting him to call down angels to help the people in Missouri. Late in February of 1834, Parley Pratt and Lyman Wright arrive from Missouri storming for action. So their plan that they bring to Joseph and the other members is, we're outnumbered there. It doesn't matter what we do, we're outnumbered. But if we bring an army from here, from Kirtland, if we march out there with an army, then we can actually do something. The enthusiasm that greeted this plan stiffened Joseph to a decision. Quick springing visions of an army of liberation marching triumphantly into the promised land. Behold, I say unto you, a new revelation stated, the redemption of Zion must needs come by power. Therefore I will raise up unto my people a man who shall lead them like as Moses led the children of Israel. For ye are the children of Israel, and the seed of Abraham, and ye must needs be led out of bondage by power and with a stretched out arm. His leading elders Joseph dispatched on a whirlwind recruiting tour. So now he's seeing himself in the place of Moses, and he's imagining himself leading the people out of bondage. Joseph had hoped for an army of 500, but 2 months of vigorous recruiting yielded fewer than 200 volunteers. By the end of April, scarcely more than $100 had been raised in Kirtland, although the elders brought back $250 from converts in the East. Finally, a revelation gave the prophet permission to mortgage the property that had formerly belonged to the order. On Sunday, May 4th, 1834, the army met in Kirtland to hear an address by Rigdon. With a full and measured eloquence, he urged them to deeds of valor and promised them the glory of the Christian martyrs and the victories of the ancient Hebrew legions. At this time, he announced also that the prophet and the High Council had agreed to his suggestion that the name of the church be changed from Church of Christ to Church of Latter-day Saints. Joseph divided his army into companies of 12, allowing each one to elect its own captain. Every man was assigned a specific duty, that of cook, fireman, waterman, wagoner, horseman, or commissary. A soldier in the forefront of the group carried a white flag with the word peace lettered across it in red. On May 5th, they started out in good order, strictly observing Joseph's injunction to evade all questions and keep their destination secret. So it would be pretty impossible for a group of men marching across the country to be completely secret. So of course word gets out. But Joseph was in his element, and he kept changing positions in the group. He went by the pseudonym Captain Cook, and he kept with him at all times a very large savage bulldog. And most of the men hated this dog. It was pretty vicious. He also ended up getting a group of bodyguards of 20 bodyguards. But since they looked at him as no ordinary man, the people were okay with him having this group of bodyguards that they didn't have themselves. These guys were all really pumped up, and they all felt like they were doing something really important, that miracles were happening to them along the way. And in fact, Martin Harris offered his naked toe to a 5-foot black snake in the road. And when it refused to bite him, he proclaimed an apostolic victory over the serpent. But when he repeated the experiment with another snake, he got a severe bite on the ankle. And the company jeered uproariously at his lack of faith. Joseph publicly upbraided him for making a mockery of the Lord's gifts. And then one of my personal favorite stories, and I think a lot of people that know this story would say the same thing because it's just funny. Stopping near an Indian mound on the Illinois River, Joseph Smith excavated a skeleton from near its surface and said to his companions. So they find an Indian mound. Joseph finds a skeleton and then proceeds to tell everybody, "This man in mortal life was a white Lamanite, a large, thick-set man and a man of God. His name was Zelph. He was a warrior and a chieftain under the great prophet Onondagas, who was known from the eastern sea to the Rocky Mountains. The curse of the red skin was taken from him, or at least in part. Lifting the thigh bone, which had been broken, and pointing to an arrowhead still lodged between two ribs, he described in vivid detail the great battle in which Zelph had been killed. Brigham Young eagerly seized the arrowhead, and others carried off the leg and thigh bones for souvenirs." And this story was told in Times and Seasons and in the history of the church. Joseph always had a story for everything. And that will not stop. We'll get into a lot more of those later. We also get a preview into Brigham Young's organization skills here because he is the only person that is not short of bread, his company, because he had noticed the dangerously low supply of meal and sent forward 2 men to purchase bread more for his own soldiers in his little company. But they're starting to really run low on supplies. It was raining a lot, it was hot, the people were getting blisters, and they were reduced to living on Johnny cake and corn dodgers. The men stifled any open protest until one day when Joseph purchased a dozen cured hams that were partly spoiled. 6 of these were flung down outside his tent with the acid complaint, "We don't eat stinkin' meat." The loudest grumbler was a petulant and humorless Sylvester Smith. One day he violated the sacred camp rule by refusing to share his bread with Parley Pratt. The 2 men wrangled bitterly until Joseph burst upon them, threatening both with a scourging from the Lord. This same man, Sylvester, also got very angry because Joseph's dog almost bit him. So he said to Joseph, "If that dog bites me, I'll kill him." And Joseph said, "If you do, I'll whip you." And his temper completely got control of him. He said, "I'll whip you in the name of the Lord, and if you continue in the same spirit and don't repent, that dog will eat the flesh off your bones, and you shall not have power to resist." Of course, later on, Joseph said that he descended on purpose to the attitude of the men to show them what they looked like. He didn't really lose his temper. He was showing them what their base attitudes had become. So like I said, word got out. They're expected when they get closer to Missouri. And as they start getting there, they realize that there's no way to turn back, but that a battle with the Gentiles meant a one-sided slaughter. Lyman White, who was second in command, disagreed with Joseph on one of the places that they should go. After some arguing, Joseph said, "Thus saith the Lord God, march on." And White defiantly drew his aside and prepared to camp. So Lyman White went one way, and the majority followed the prophet and camped 8 miles out on the prairie, where they drank stinking water and went meatless to bed. But neither group was attacked. And the next day, Joseph defended himself by saying that because of God, he knew exactly what to do. And Sylvester Smith raged, "You have stamped out liberty of speech. You prophesy lies in the name of the Lord. You've got a heart corrupt as hell." Joseph seized the horn with which he called his men to prayer and flung it at his accuser with all his might. Missing him, it smashed upon the ground. To troubled, silent onlookers, this seemed an omen of evil. So meanwhile, the Missourians are still impoverished, and they know that Joseph's only bringing men, not money. But they still don't feel like they can sell their property because he told them not to, and they also feel like that it would be going against God because they're supposed to build a temple there. And what will they do if they sell the property? So they know, once they're there, they know that they cannot win any battles. This is not going to work out the way Joseph expected it to. So he finally promised Zion's camp would not cross the Missouri into Jackson County. He proposed a peace plan. He said that the Mormons would purchase all the property of all the settlers in Jackson County, who were the Mormon baiters, the price to be set by 12 disinterested men, and the payment made in 1 year. He insisted, however, that the damages already sustained by his people must be deducted from the value of the property. Then he called his men together and read a new revelation commanding them to wait for a little season for the redemption of Zion. For behold, I do not require at their hands to fight the battles of Zion. I will fight your battles. Behold, the destroyer I have sent forth to destroy and lay waste mine enemies, and not many years hence they shall not be left to pollute mine heritage. For it is my will that these lands should be purchased. Sue for peace, not only to the people that have smitten you, but also to all people. The revelation went on to say that the men of the army had been brought to Missouri for a trial of their faith. Now they were to return to Kirtland and receive their reward, a great blessing or endowment which would be bestowed in the Kirtland temple. Zion could not be redeemed until all her leading elders had been so blessed. So this whole trip has been a waste, basically. He's saying now, the only reason we came here wasn't actually to fight like we said we were going to. It wasn't to come in and save them like we said we were going to. It was a trial of your faith. And now that you've proven yourself, we're going to go back and you get this endowment in the temple. Lyman Wight shouted for action and was pacified only by a personal perusal of the revelation. But of course, during this time, the men started coming down with cholera. 14 men died from the cholera. At first, Joseph tried to heal the people, but then he quickly learned, he said, by painful experience, that when Jehovah decrees destruction upon any people and makes known his determination, man must not attempt to stay his hand. The moment I attempted to rebuke the disease, I was attacked, and had not I desisted in my attempt to save the life of a brother, I would have sacrificed my own. So he says that because he tried to heal them, he got cholera. And so there was no attempt at that point then to give blessings or to try to heal them. And now they're going to go back to Kirtland. Chapter 11 is called Patronage and Punishment. She writes, far from being a second Moses, he had left the exiled colony still outside the promised land and had returned with little except consoling words for the families of the 14 dead. Kirtland met him with a hostility that exceeded his worst fears. So he gets charged in a council meeting and has to argue for hour upon hour upon hour for himself and for what happened. Innuendos concerning the mishandling of funds were met by calling for reports from several commissaries who defended him earnestly. He retold the story of his quarrels with Sylvester Smith, making Sylvester, out to be the one that was in the wrong. And finally, after 6 hours, the man began to stammer an apology, and Joseph relaxed, victorious, and spent. Once the crisis was past, Joseph set about assuaging the feeling of frustration that followed the failure of Zion's camp. He had promised his men a great endowment in the temple, and now bent his energy and enthusiasm toward that. All converts who stopped in Kirtland on the way to Missouri were reminded that Zion would remain in bondage until the Kirtland temple was finished. When John Tanner, who had just sold 2 farms and 2,200 acres of timber, visited Kirtland, and learned that the temple mortgage was about to be foreclosed, he canceled his plans to go to Missouri, loaned the temple committee $13,000, signed a note with the prophet for $30,000 worth of goods, and gave Joseph an additional personal loan of $2,000. At this point, he started also rewarding people with positions based on what they give and what they do. He also enlarged his priesthood to include 12 apostles and a special quorum of 70 men. 9 of the apostles and all the 70s were members of his army. He took his title and changed it from first elder to president of the high priesthood. The church was now governed by 5 councils: the presidency, the apostles, the 70s, and the 2 high councils of Kirtland and Missouri. A revelation gave them all equal authority. But soon as a rivalry would spring up among the 5 bodies. The apostles, who were Joseph's favorite and ablest men, quickly garnered so much power that the Kirtland High Council protested that they were setting themselves up as an independent council, subject to no authority of the church, a kind of outlaw. The 12, however, listened to no one but their prophet. None were over 36. 4 were only 24. Joseph himself was still under 30. The poet-journalist W.W. Phelps coined in one idle hour a name for each of them. So Brigham Young he styled the Lion of the Lord. Orson Pratt was the gauge of philosophy. Parley was the archer of paradise. Lyman Wight was the wild ram of the mountains. And these would stick with the men for life. Joseph would again compare himself to Moses by saying that the duty of the president of the church was to preside over the whole church and be like unto Moses. His word was law of God, against which there could be no appeal. Soon it was officially announced that an insult to Joseph would be an insult to the whole body. And so nobody would stand for it. The membership voted on the church officers twice a year, but there was only one slate of candidates, and it was selected by the first presidency, comprised of Joseph himself and his 2 counselors. Dissenting votes quickly became so rare that the elections came to be called the sustaining of the authorities, and that's still what they call it, and it's still rare to have people say no about somebody, and when you do, it doesn't really do any good anyway. Joseph was particularly generous with positions to members of his own family. His father was made patriarch. Hiram early replaced F.G. Williams as the 3rd man in the presidency, along with Joseph and Rigdon. Don Carlos Smith, although only 19, was appointed president of the high priests, and Samuel Smith became general agent for the literary firm, which supervised all the church publications. Most of the people seemed to accept this nepotism until he made William, his kind of ne'er-do-well brother, an apostle as well. In this chapter, she tells the story of William and Joseph getting into a fist fight and how he had to be brought in front of everybody, and Joseph really had to fight for William to not be kicked out, but that brother would become a thorn in his side forever. It is also during this time that the word of wisdom comes out. And what's interesting about this is that I always was taught the word of wisdom was something, right, almost from the beginning, just like this, but that it was something that nobody thought of before, that nobody knew that these things were bad for you, like smoking or, whatever. And it was just it was another one of those miraculous things that Joseph would come up with this word of wisdom. But that's not the case. In 1834, there were 5,000 temperance societies in the United States, with a membership of over 1 million. 90% of these concentrated in New York and Ohio. After 1836, when the American Temperance Society adopted total abstinence in its platform, there was scarcely a Protestant preacher on the Western Reserve who had not taken the pledge. The lesser stimulants were likewise abused. Tobacco was called a nerve-prostrating and soul-paralyzing drug. Coffee was deplored as an excitant to amorousness, and tea drinking was thought to be as bad as toddy guzzling. Food fads and alcoholic cures periodically swept the nation. The Popular Journal of Health, published from 1829 to 1835, held that sparing use of meat was responsible for the robustness of the Irish and recommended a vegetarian diet. Self-denial was nowhere more fashionable than among the minor sects. And so in 1833, when he dictated a revelation called the Word of Wisdom, it was abstaining from tobacco, alcohol, and hot drinks, only wine at communion, and meat only in winter. Joseph made it very clear, however, that the revelation was given not by commandment or constraint, but merely as good counsel, which is so funny because it is one of the most important things for people to do nowadays. And I was never told that this was not a commandment. I was never told that, this is just a guideline of something to stay away from, because you're even asked before you can get a temple recommend of whether you do these things. It was very interesting to me to find out that even Joseph himself said it was not by commandment, and that it came in a time of temperance when actually all of these things were being talked about by other people. Brigham Young later described that the circumstances that led to it were that when the men would meet for the school of prophets above room in the prophet's kitchen, Emma complained bitterly after each gathering of having to clean so filthy a floor, for the first thing they did was to light their pipes, and while smoking, talk about the great things of the kingdom and spit all over the room. This made the prophet think upon the matter, and he inquired of the Lord relating to the conduct of the elders in using tobacco, and the revelation known as the Word of Wisdom was the result of this inquiry. For some years, in fact, Joseph did not take his word of wisdom seriously. After a double wedding in January, he wrote in his journal, "We then partook of some refreshments, and our hearts were made glad with the fruit of the vine." In December 4th, 1836, Rigdon, a fanatical temperance enthusiast, forced through a vote for total abstinence. Joseph bowed to the public opinion, replaced wine with water in the communion, and let the High Council do its worst. And now it has become the sign of every good Mormon to not do those things. But what is funny is we will find out later, Joseph was still drinking later on, and even the night before he died. So that was 2 very short chapters this week, and not a lot going on, but we're just laying the foundation for the next things to come. Next week, I'm going to get into a subject that was very important in my deconstruction. In fact, it's one of the first things that led me out of the Mormon Church, and that is the Book of Abraham.